Okay, well, good evening, comrades, and welcome to this evening's session in the Revolution series, organised by comrades from the Labour Left Alliance. Tonight's session is entitled Bourgeois and Proletarians, and it's discussing the development of socialist ideas in the 1840s up to the 1860s. That's a very significant period of socialist ideas. Not only does it, of course, include the development of Chartism as a mass movement in the 1830s and 40s, but it also includes the period when Marx and Engels are writing the Communist Manifesto, and when there are quite major debates, very significant debates about the nature of socialism, its relationship to communism, for example, and above all, the role of various classes and social groups in achieving socialism, and in particular that the role of the industrial working class, the proletariat. Indeed, the phrase bourgeois and proletarians is a section from the Communist Manifesto, and it is a really sort of major idea of the proletariat as the revolutionary class, and that socialism is an ideology, a universal change in society that will be achieved by the proletariat. So we've got Marc Mulholland again this evening. Marc had done one of the previous sessions, and he'll be leading this session. We'll follow the usual format of around about a half an hour to 40 minutes, an introduction, followed by questions and discussion, and then Marc will come back both to intervene in the discussion, but also to sum up at the end. Could I ask comrades to use the blue hand function under our participants, but they can also use the chat section if they want to come in to ask a question. Okay, well, it's over to Marc now. So really looking forward to bourgeois and proletarians. So off you go, Marc.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks, comrades. I'm going to do this by mentioning particular thinkers and just very quickly saying who they were and what they said. And I'll begin a little bit before 1840, just because I think the background is necessary. Beginning with Count Claude Henri de Saint-Simon, who's born in 1760, died in 1825. As you can tell from the name, he is French. He was born in Paris. At the beginning of the French Revolution, he gave up his aristocratic title, and nonetheless, revolution was a turbulent time, and he was accused of corruption at some point and arrested in 1793 for a year. But by 1803, he was publishing lots of pamphlets, and he really kind of founds modern socialist thought. Socialism of a particular type. He was very enthusiastic on modernity, and what he wanted to see was society being, in effect, run by experts, by which he meant primarily industrialists and academics. He thought they should run society in an ordered way for the benefit of the laboring masses. But he didn't think the working classes would bring this about. He thought it'd be brought about by the intellectuals, by the industrialists, by the experts. It's only in his very last work, The New Christianity, which is how he thought of his own belief system, published in 1825, did he suggest that maybe the working classes would be a fruitful constituency for the propagation of his ideas. Even then, he thought that the laboring poor would not be effective agents in their own emancipation. They'd just be an enthusiastic audience for his ideas. It's really those who followed on from Saint-Simon who elaborated the system, who develops it into a kind of something which looks a bit more like modern socialism. Barrault and Enfantin, two followers, after he died, systematized what Saint-Simon had said. They argued that the old dynamic bourgeoisie had become simply inheritors of wealth. They no longer justified themselves as wealth creators. Instead, they accumulated wealth doing nothing, whilst everybody else, or in particular, they referred to the class of proletarians, those who had to work for this bourgeoisie. In that sense, they really introduced the term proletariat into modern socialist and indeed general discourse. They reckoned that in the future planned society, people would be rewarded in proportion to their efforts and their ability. So if you had lots of ability and you worked hard, you get more money than everybody else. But you would no longer benefit simply from inheriting wealth. So to some extent, they anticipated the state taking over wealth and redistributing it generation by generation in order to pass it under the control of the most dynamic and the most intelligent, a kind of recreation of a dynamic bourgeoisie every generation, rather than having a bourgeoisie simply based upon inherited wealth. They proposed in particular bankers as an efficient and disinterested ruling class. So if you like, early socialism was about rule of the bankers, whatever you make of that. This is French socialism. If you go and look at Britain, well, you can't avoid Robert Owen, born in 1771, lived a good long time, died in 1858. He is Welsh. He was, in many respects, the most impressive capitalist of his generation. He was a self-made capitalist. He ran the amazingly successful New Lanark mill in Scotland, which became a model not just of good treatment of workers, but being incredibly profitable. And he became, understandably, very self-confident. The most striking thing about Robert Owen's personality is that he always reckoned he was right, never bothered by criticism. At one point, his dad wrote to him, or his father-in-law wrote to him, "Thou needest be right, or thou art very positive." Owen argued that human nature was essentially plastic. That is, it could be improved almost indefinitely. And what he wished to see was the proletariat, the wage laboring working class, being saved from the brutalizations of their lives. He felt that with a humanitarian but paternalistic, even authoritarian treatment of the working class, their nature could be reshaped, for human nature is ultimately reshapeable. As he said, man may be trained to acquire any sentiments and habits or any character. So what he wanted was if you like, a factory or a rather kind of cooperative communities, which would be run more or less top down, but which would be humane, which would be much better than the backbiting competitive society which degraded the working classes, which would save the proletariat from their own degraded personalities, as was found in the hyper-competitive capitalist economy. Jumping back to France, because this is a contrast to this view of human nature, I want to look briefly at Charles Fourier, who was born in 1772 and died in 1837. Whilst Owen saw human nature as completely plastic, completely changeable, conditions entirely create consciousness, Fourier looked at it from the other end of the telescope. Fourier thought that you should build a kind of socialism around pre-existing human nature. Fourier had a great interest in music, and he thought that the harmony in music could also be identified, at least potentially, in the harmony of society. So he developed a theory of social organization, socialism, which is based around balancing instinctive human needs and requirements, the human need to play, the human need to work. And if you balance it all up, you can get a rational human society. So, for example, he thought about reorganizing society along the lines of communities that he called phalanxes, which would be comprise 1,000 to 2,000 persons, which would combine security, but also creative work. They would be not entirely rigidly egalitarian. Rather, profit from these phalanxes would be distributed between those who contributed their labor, those who contributed capital, and those who contributed talent, their ability. And these would be at the proportions of labor would get 5, capital would get 4, talent would get 3. About the working classes, Fourier thought that the wage worker hates his job on average, and he wants to become a productive property owner. So really what Fourier imagined of these phalanxes is that workers would become part owners of production, along with those who brought along capital and those who brought along talent. So these are forms of socialism which are floating about. They're all socialism, not really political forms of socialism. They're about how you'd set up ideal communities. And the hope was these ideal communities would link up and through force of example would overcome capitalist anarchy. A very different kind of socialist, and indeed one who thereby was known as communist, was Louis Auguste Blanc, born in 1805, 1881. For most of the 19th century, if you mentioned revolutionary, people would say, oh, you mean like Blanc? He was the model revolutionary, a dedicated revolutionary from his youth, involved in every French insurrection during his life, and there was a lot of them. He spent 30 years of his life in prison because of his involvement in these insurrections. And he understood communism not so much as a specific form of social organization, but rather as a movement of the propertyless working classes. Initially, he thought of the working classes fairly generally. Someone's asking how Blanc is spelled, B-L-A-N-Q-U-I. He thought of the working classes as including wage earners, peasants, everybody who had to labor. As he got older, he put more attention upon the urban working classes in particular, which he thought were the most dynamic component of any revolution. So what Blanc really brings to the mix is the idea that the masses are a revolutionary agency in their own emancipation, and in particular, the urban wage-earning masses. His view of how revolution happens was the secret, a conspiratorial society operating under illegal conditions would organize the insurrection. And the insurrection basically was the demonstration becomes the riot leads to the barricades going up, the barricades leads to the insurrection in the capital city, which surrounds the center of government and overthrows it. It wasn't about mass democratic organization. It's about underground conspiratorial organization to detonate the spontaneously revolutionary urban masses. So desperately important, Blanc. Another French thinker I want to mention is Flora Tristan. That's Flora, Tristan, T-R-I-S-T-A-N. She was born in 1803, a sadly short life. She died in 1844. She'd been born of Paris, of aristocratic Peruvian Spanish descent, so she is of mixed race. She is rightly a feminist heroine these days. Her marriage to she had a terrible marriage to a horrible man who broke off that marriage and went off with her children, depriving her of 2 children. And she had to chase him. She had to chase him through the courts to get any access at all. She traveled widely using the wealth of her aristocratic relatives. And when she arrived back from Peru in 1835, she mingled with socialists and artists in Paris and London, all the time being pursued by her hideous husband, who went as far as to try and assassinate her. She is extraordinarily vivacious, very charismatic, and she got involved in the worker movement. She's often been dismissed because her writing tends to be a bit heightened and emotional. George Lichtheim, who is a kind of post-war Marxist historian, who's a grumpy kind of fellow, said her work is not part of the history of socialist theory because she is too emotional. This is really wrong. She is very interested in how workers actually lived. She visited Britain in 1840. She visited Parliament disguised as a man because women weren't allowed in at the time. She saw Daniel O'Connell speak. She visited a factory in London. She went to a Chartist meeting. And what's really important is what she defines about latent working class consciousness. That's right, she was Gauguin's grandmother. She said, what does the working class actually demand? And she said, they demand their own property, the only one that it can ever possess, its arms. Yes, its arms, its patrimony, its unique wealth. What does she mean by its arms? She meant that what the wage earner possesses is nothing more than the ability to labor. The ability to labor only has meaning in terms of collective work under the, when you get to the collective labor of capitalism. Therefore, the working class, the modern the modern wage-earning working class can only protect its own property, its ability to work, through the collective ownership and control of the means of production. Because under capitalism, the means of production have become collective. Look at the factory. You can't work in the factory as a collective enterprise, which can only be owned and run collectively if it's not owned by the individual capitalist. So I think Tristan, more than anyone, clearly points out why the modern wage-earning working class should have a socialist consciousness. She tried to organize the working class, using as her model the Irish Catholic civil rights movement of Daniel O'Connell. And she made quite a lot of advance in this regard before she is struck down by illness and died in 1844. Now, as those who were here last week will know, there is a major working class movement or political party in Chartism. Itself, it wasn't socialist, but it did have a socialistic left wing. Probably the most important theoretician of this left wing was Bronte O'Brien, born in 1804, died in 1873, of Irish background, an indefatigable writer, and one who tried to connect Chartism to a kind of Blanc style socialism. He is unusually internationalist in his thinking, unusual for in Chartist terms, and indeed grew somewhat friendly to Friedrich Engels in the early 1840s and with Karl Marx later on in the decade. Even closer to Marx and Engels were Julian Harney and Ernest Jones. These were the links between the British working class Chartist movement and European socialist thinking. At one end of that link was Bronte O'Brien, and even more so Ernest Jones and Julian Harney. At the other end of that link were primarily Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx and Engels were both in the German Hegelian philosophical tradition. Really what they wished to do philosophically was combine the human, combine man with society and nature, feeling that man was alienated from society and nature. By 1844, Marx has come to the view that the only way to do this was through socialist revolution, and the revolution would be carried out by the proletariat. In this regard, Marx is close ideologically to the socialist thinkers, but closer politically in some respects to Blanc, in that Blanc looked to the proletariat as the main agent of revolution, but closest of all to the Chartists, because the Chartists believed not in conspiratorial politics, the mass self-emancipation of the working classes. But Marx and Engels thought of themselves as communists rather than simply theoretical socialists. Therefore, they associated themselves with the Communist League, mostly kind of German workers in Britain in the 1840s. And of course, they wrote the manifesto for this league, the famous manifesto of the Communist Party, or the Communist Manifesto as we know it. Now, the main French socialist thinker, and probably the most significant socialist thinker in the 1840s anywhere, is Louis Blanc. Blanc, B-L-A-N-C. Blanc had been born in Spain, but came to France in 1833, where he acted as a tutor for an industrialist family, for the family of an industrialist. He begins writing for the democratic press and very quickly becomes a democratic socialist. When I say democratic, I mean that he thought the most important first aim was to extend the franchise, to have workers get the vote. In this respect, he's very different from Fourier and Owen, who weren't really interested in democratic politics. He's passionately committed to democracy and the universal suffrage. This, he believed, would transform the state into an instrument of progress. It would establish the democratic social republic, as he called it, which then which would go on to not take over and plan the economy, but rather would facilitate cooperative production on the part of workers. Workers would set up cooperatives, much as Fourier and Owen had been in favor of, but rather than have these cooperatives struggle against capitalist competition, Blanc said that they must be backed up by the power of the state. So the state would ensure the right to work. The right to work would be realized through national workshops, and national workshops would be cooperatives, worker cooperatives, backed up by the power of the state. But he believed after a couple of years, these cooperatives would be able to stand on their own feet, and they would no longer need to be, if you like, artificially supported by the state. Blanc wrote a very widely read book called The Organization of Labor in 1839. And Blanc himself went on to be briefly a member of the provisional Republican government established in France in 1848 before he stepped out of it. So he's the first socialist ever to sit in a government, if briefly. Now, the failure of the 1848 revolutions actually makes a lot of people think that socialism ideologically is dead. And people say this, they say that, well, that's it, socialism is dead, the worker movement is dead, it's all over. And a lot of people think this for a long time. It's true, Robert Owen is still alive, but he's a pretty old man by this point. Fourier is dead, Fleur Tristan's dead, the Saint-Simeons have really stopped being at all interested in the worker movement, and they've become kind of enthusiasts for capitalist dynamism. So Marx and Engels are still kicking around in London. Really, they just look like a couple of people amidst a small refugee group of people who are kind of irrelevant to anything. Louis Blanc is also a refugee in London at the time. He's still the best known socialist anywhere. But really people identify him with the failure of the 1848 revolutions. Nobody thinks he's going to come back. Nobody really thinks that socialism is going to come back. They think, well, that's over. The one socialist thinker or socialistic thinker who does get a bit of a reputation in the 1850s is another French guy, Pierre Joseph Proudhon. He'd been born in 1809, dies in 1865. Proudhon, a bit like the earlier socialists, really doesn't have much time for politics. He is actually elected to the National Assembly in France in 1848. But he stays out, for example, he remains aloof from the worker rebellion called the June Days in the east of Paris in 1848. All he does actually is rent a room above the barricades so he can watch what's going on, but he doesn't participate. Proudhon is unusually amongst early socialists, basically of working class background. Most of the other people are pretty middle class, including obviously Marx and Engels. He made himself notorious with his pamphlet of 1840, What is Property, where he says property is theft. But actually, he's a great enthusiast for property. A capitalist property is theft, but he's much in favor of the small-scale property of the family, the small farm or the workshop. This is the basis for his socialism, is small-scale property. What he wants to see is the family enterprise rather than the capitalist enterprise being the center of production, and that the family should be supported not by the state, but by law. That is, law will establish and regulate relations, cooperative relations between family-scale enterprises. And in particular, it will provide what he called gratuitous credit. That is basically free loans to make sure that the small family enterprise can persist, that the small family enterprise innumerable small family enterprises would relate to each other, would stand on their own 2 feet, would exchange with one another, and you would have no need for wage labor. So he's not very much in favor of wage labor. In this sense, he's not very keen on the modern wage earning working class. I have had enough of the vile multitude and demagogues, he said to a colleague in 1852. The poorest class, and today the most numerous, is by the very fact of its poverty the most ungrateful, the most envious, the most immoral, and the most cowardly. In particular, he didn't like the wage-earning proletariat. He said of the proletariat that it's a form of slavery, the proletarian condition. It is an evil I want to destroy, not a god to whom I offer. The proletarian is a human machine, unfit both for comfort and education. His personality tends towards a barbarism born of misery. He calculated there are 10 million proletarians in France, nearly a third of the population. That's 10 million too many. For the heart of the proletaire, he said, is like that of the rich man, a sewer of boiling sensuality, the home of crapulence and imposture. So what he really liked was the small-scale producer, the family producer. In this sense, he was a romanticizer of the bucolic and petty bourgeois life, an inveterate opponent of parasites, rapacious bankers, and in the Elysian common of the time, the supposed malign influence of the Jew. Hostility to Jewishness is pretty common in socialist circles at this time, but it reaches a really intense heights with Proudhon. Proudhon is really the most influential socialist thinker in France in the 1850s, partly because the state didn't mind him, because he argued against political involvement and he argued against the organization of the proletariat. So basically, the regime of France of Napoleon III didn't mind him that much, so he had plenty of publicity. He's also a pretty good writer, and he was a man of the working classes, so he went down well with working class audience, and went down particularly well with the working classes who wanted to get back to small-scale production. And if we look at the first international, the International Working Men's Association, it's established by the British trade unions. The guy who does all the secretarial work in London, because the British trade unionists really aren't that bothered with it, is Karl Marx. But an awful lot of the, at least initial membership of the First International are influenced by Proudhonian ideas. And the First International, established in 1864, can be seen as a kind of combination of British trade unionists on the one hand, who are pretty skeptical about socialism, though they're not against it, but they're just not that enthusiastic. And on the other hand, French workers influenced by Proudhon, who looked at this idea of the family enterprise as being the basis of the new society, which will supersede capitalism. However, in between, if you like, is Marx. And Marx pushes this idea of the self-emancipation of the proletariat and a kind of worker movement which is not hostile to the modern proletariat, as Proudhon had been, is not hostile, for example, to strikes and trade unions, but will build upon that. So Marx's theorization gets a lot of gets a good response, not so much because everybody's busily reading Capital when it's published in 1866, but rather because they like his idea of a socialism which builds upon the actual worker movement, not looking back to small petty production as the Proudhonists were prone to do, and not romanticizing excessively the cooperatives, because the problem with these socialist cooperatives is that every time somebody tries to set them up, they're just driven into the ground by capitalist competition. So we'll just take a quick look at Marx's Capital, which of course is his big theoretical contribution published in the mid-1860s. It's got a ton of stuff in it. I'm going to make some points about it, which are in Capital. I'm going to avoid the more abstruse points about labor theory of value and tendency the rate of profit to fall and the transformation value, both because it's a bit of a headache to try and summarize in 5 minutes, and also because at the time it's probably not really what's appealing about Marxism, if that's how we describe it. Now, what Marx argued in Capital was lots of stuff, but some key points he made. First of all, he said that the main property that workers own, the main commodity they own, is their labor power. That is their ability to labor for wages. You might be going, oh, that sounds a bit like Fourier Tristan, and I'd agree with you. It does sound like Fourier Tristan. Marx, as far as I can tell, thought very well of Tristan, but actually rarely quoted her, if at all. Not sure he ever did, but he did think well of her. Now, he says that workers look upon their ability to labor as something their own property. And how do they deal with this property? Well, like everybody else, they try to sell it for the best price they can get. And they sell it in a way that you get a good price for it, but also in a way that they can preserve the value of their labor. And this means the worker tries to limit the working day, because the capitalist wants the worker to work as long and as hard as possible for their wages. But the worker says, well, if I do that, I'll wear my property out, I'll drive myself into the ground, and my property, my ability to labor, will lose its value, because I'll get worn out, I'll not be able to work anymore, I'll grow old prematurely. By the time I'm 30, my ability to labor will be losing its value because I'm simply worn out. So as Marx said, the worker thinks in this way: I demand a normal working day. That meant in the 1860s a limited working day, an 8-hour working day. I demand an 8-hour working day because like every other seller, I demand the value of my commodity. What's the commodity of a worker? It's the ability to labor. And Marx saw this in Capital as really important because it means the worker struggles more than for anything else for a limited working day. Marx argued in Capital that the main struggle between the workers and capitalists in the history of capitalism to that point has been the struggle for a limited working day. And this is very notable in British politics, where indeed the struggle for the 10-hour working day had been the major theme of worker politics in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And Marx saw this as important because it's not just an individual struggle between individual workers in a factory and the capitalist. It inevitably becomes a societal struggle between the workers as a class and the capitalists as a class. Why? Because a legally limited working day in the end becomes a political question, because it's a question which requires legal enactment. And Marx in Capital gives a history of the struggle, which includes Chartism, which was talked about last week. And he notes that by the 1850s, the 10-hour working day is won by the British working class. What does this mean? Well, Marx says in Capital, it means a wonderful development because because of the limited working day, workers get a bit of free time. And this means the physical and moral regeneration of the factory workers, which is visible, he says, to even the weakest eye. So the working class wins something very important, and in so doing, it increases its moral and indeed physical ability to go on and organize and to win more. The isolated worker is more or less helpless. The workers seeking a major political demand not only is victorious in winning the 10-hour working day, but in so doing regenerates itself. And in Capital, Marx points out what he considered to be the most important resolution passed by the First Workers' International, the resolution passed at the 1866 Geneva Convention. And that resolution said, we declare that the limitation of the working day is the preliminary condition without which all further attempts at improvement and emancipation must prove abortive. Marx pointed out in Capital that the workers had put their heads together, and as a class, they had compelled the passing of a law. And this law was an all-powerful social barrier by which they can be prevented from selling themselves and their families into slavery and death. So Marx is very clear. The workers must win these reforms in order to constitute themselves as an effective class. They must win, as he put it, the modest Magna Carta of the legally limited working day. But this is only the beginning of factory legislation. Marx described as the first conscious and methodological reaction of society against capitalism. Now, Marx argued in Capital that what capitalism does is it makes production essentially a collective enterprise. Before capitalism, production is basically the farm or the small workshop. Capitalism makes production classically through the factory, something which is organized collectively. And in so doing, it makes a collective working class. Marx thought that as capitalism developed, it would develop particularly technologically, that it would need less and less workers because it would have more and more machines to take the place of workers. The result of this, Marx argued, would be the inevitable development of what he called the reserve army of labor. The reserve army of labor, which essentially meant the unemployed and the underemployed. And it was the reserve army of labor which always put the working class on the back foot. That is, they're always at a disadvantage. The capitalists can say, well, you can take this job at the wages I'm offering, or you can join the unemployed. And this means there's an inevitable contradiction between the interest of the workers and the interests of the capitalists. What happens is that capitalism develops the collective nature of production in the modern era, but so long as the collective production of the modern era is under the control of individual capitalists, it'll work against the interests of the proletariat. But in so doing, it'll also work against the interests of society, because society, if it wants to get the best out of the collective, collectively organized means of production, must have a way of collectively controlling and organizing the means of production. And so Marx said in Capital, at a certain stage of development, capitalism generates new forces and new passions that spring up in the bosom of society. These new forces and new passions ultimately are the proletariat, and the passions of the proletariat get some kind of collective control over the means by which they live, as Flora Tristan had said back in the 1840s, was the instinctive desire of the proletariat to get a collective ownership over the means by which they live. I think this is very important, just as a side issue. What was the really appealing slogan of the Brexiteers in the working class communities? It was bring back control. And this idea of having some kind of control over the means by which you live is fundamentally a proletarian psychology against the competitive psychology of the bourgeoisie. I'm not saying, by the way, that the Brexiteers were proletarian in any way, but they were, if you like, demagogically appealing as part of their overall nativist appeal to a certain aspect of proletarian psychology, such as Marx had outlined in Capital. Marx said, as soon as the capitalist mode of production stands on its own 2 feet, from that point, the further socialization of labor demands the transformation of the means of production, from being controlled individually by the capitalists to being controlled collectively by society. And it is the worker who has this interest in expropriating the capitalist. Now, just to finish off, how did Marx and Engels think about the organization of socialism? If you look at Owen, if you look at Fourier, if you look at Blanc, if you look at Saint-Simon, they're all really quite detailed about how socialism would be organized. Because Marx and Engels were interested in the self-emancipation of the proletariat and the proletariat organizing themselves as a political class, they went out of their way not really to explain how socialism might work in practice. That's a good idea, really, in the circumstances of the 1860s, because it avoids this kind of, getting involved in one person's clever idea or another about how to organize the future of society. In retrospect, it's probably not such a good idea, because I think actually for socialists now, it really is quite important to present a model of, not in super detail, but in reasonable detail about how a non-capitalist society might operate. That's a different subject. Marx and Engels did have something to say about this, though, and I'm not going to go into any kind of detail about it, but I just want to quote one letter that Engels wrote after the end of the period we're looking at, a letter he wrote to August Bebel, I think in the 1890s, where Engels wrote, neither Marx or I have ever doubted that in the course of transition to a wholly communist economy, widespread use would have to be made of cooperative management as an intermediate stage. only it'll mean so organizing things that society, that is initially the state, retains ownership of the means of production and thus prevent the particular interests of the cooperatives from taking precedence over those of society as a whole. This is interesting for 2 points. One, it means that they don't have that same faith in cooperatives that Robert Owen or Fourier or Louis Blanc had. They believed that for quite a long period at least, that the state had to stand as the representative of wider society, which would support the cooperatives, but the worker cooperatives themselves could not represent wider society. You needed something standing over that, and at least in the first instance, that would mean the state. And this is why Marx and Engels and socialists of their type are really interested in democracy, because democracy is a way of how the working class could get some overall control of the state. The second point is that Marx and Engels did not dismiss the earlier tradition of cooperatives. Indeed, they saw cooperatives as probably key to the gradual construction of a socialist and then communist economy. Because what's significant about Marx and Engels, or one thing which is significant about them, is that they saw the revolution as being something which is quite compressed. If we think about workers overthrowing the bourgeoisie and taking control of the state, what they called sometimes the dictatorship of the proletariat, but they did not see the construction of a socialist economy in this same concentrated revolutionary way. That, they believed, would be a longer-term process in which worker cooperatives within the framework of a worker state would be a really important part of that process by which a socialistic economy would be built. But I think I should leave it there.
Well, thanks very much, Marc, and a very wide-ranging discussion. I must say I'm glad you've introduced us to Flora Tristan, who I've not come across, and I noticed in the chat box that a number of comrades mentioned that. Can I just remind comrades that if you'd like to make a contribution or ask a question, please use the chat box and or the participant box and click on with the blue hand. So I've got, I think the first comrade who's indicated they want to speak is Tony Greenstein. So Tony, if you'd like to come in, please.
Thank you, comrades. I was interested in what you said. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine, Tony. Go ahead.
I was interested in what you said about Proudhon, who seems to me to be a thoroughly reactionary person. He looks backward, not forwards. It's a kind of, I think, what Marx and Engels called feudal socialism. He believes in small producers, the ideal capitalism, which we still see today, of course. He was also clearly anti-Semitic. So in what sense do you say he was a socialist or on the left?
I mean, it's a good question. He certainly was anti-Semitic. And indeed, in the 1940s, during the pro-fascist Vichy regime in France, they actually pick up on Proudhon and say he's a cool dude, you know. So he is a progenitor of a extreme right, but he is also a progenitor of the left, and you do get this kind of contradiction within him. He's a vigorous critic of capitalism, for sure. He's in favor, it's true, of small-scale production. Small-scale production of itself is not such a bad thing, actually. And probably if you are building a post-capitalist society, you're more likely to have fairly small-scale enterprises, a lot of them, rather than big, huge factories. It's not much fun working in a big, huge factory. And his arguments of a cooperative economy, Marx certainly saw that as limited, and that's why he writes Poverty of Philosophy, which is his at times rather tedious assault upon Proudhon. But one point he's making is that if you simply have cooperatives trying to exchange with one another, they will inevitably evolve into capitalism. I'm not sure that's right, actually, but that's Marx's argument. I think more convincingly, Marx does say that you need some wider framework, which is more than simply law, in order to support, to elaborate, and to develop an economy of cooperatives. But I think any kind of socialism is likely to have a big role for cooperatives. So that's the kind of good side of Proudhon. The bad side of him, yeah, he's a total anti-Semite. He's also a complete anti-feminist, and he's quite keen on war because war is good for the spirit. So good sides and bad sides of Proudhon. And in some respects, it's easier to see the bad sides of him because they jump out at you and it's genuinely nasty. But I think it's important also to understand and appreciate the progressive elements of what he said, because they were so influential in the 1850s. And Marx, much as he disliked Proudhon, they got on initially quite well, but then they fell out quite badly. He disliked Proudhon, but he is very aware that he is working with Proudhonists in the First International, that these kinds of ideas were significant. And Marx didn't really spend any time attacking Proudhon's cooperativism. What he attacked was Proudhon's anti-politics, that is, Proudhon's lifelong disdain for the struggle for democracy. In some respects, Marx had an opening, because just before he bit the dust, Proudhon somewhat began changing his mind, where he began to speak rather more favorably about the proletariat. He began to, I think, just for the simple reason that he found, to his surprise, that his ideas are going down quite well with the wage-earning proletariat. So Proudhon picked up on this. It meant Proudhonism in the years of the First International was on a kind of trajectory, which meant they were willing to cooperate with the British trade unionists, who certainly had no time for going back to small-scale petty production, and they're willing to work with Marx. And Marx, if you read his letters, he's a grumpy old sod. He's always moaning about everybody. If you look at what he does actively, he's actually very good at working with people who he doesn't quite agree with. If you look at people who work with Marx and Engels, they always say that Engels is really hard to get on with because he's quite vain and quite argumentative. They always say that about Engels. You say about Marx, he's great, you know. Marx, you can have a good argument with him. He's willing to see both sides of an argument, and Marx will do boring secretarial work. So you don't get that impression if you read Marx's letters, which are very different, mostly because the letters we have are overwhelmingly his letters to Engels. And you don't get that sense if you read his angry polemics. But if you look at his life, actually, he's very good at cooperating. So in that sense, Proudhon's part of the history of socialism, because he's part of that history, and there's nasty elements to the history of socialism. Marx, at the time, says, "Hey, I don't like Proudhon, but we can work with the Proudhonists. We can move them in the direction we'd like to move."
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Marc. I'm going to use my position, perhaps be a bit of a Blanciste on this. I'm interested in how far the French Revolution influences tactics and strategy, particularly, the idea of the crowd, of the mass of the population, as opposed to maybe the more conspiratorial ideas. When I gave a talk on Babeuf, I was very interested in the tension between those two ideas, and the way that in the French Revolution, the great days of the revolution, as it were, often involve mass mobilizations, and indeed the idea of the demonstration and the seizure of power, in key incidents was very important. But it also seems from what you've said that certain socialists were drawing a lesson about organization, and I'm interested in and this is going to be a debate. I mean, it's still a debate. It's a debate in the LLA, for example, about the relationship, say, between consciousness and organization and between mass movements. And I wonder how far the French Revolution stayed as the template, and then how far these socialists that we're talking about picked up on the lessons from 1848 as well. You know, they're working on these things, as it were, in real time. So, you know, that's something I'm interested in. Also, one other, just a very brief point, one other question is on this question of anti-Semitism, which has been, you know, thrown at the left more generally. I'm not really talking about the current nonsense on anti-Semitism. I'm really talking about another argument that that there is a strong current of anti-Semitism. You mentioned Proudhon, but I wonder again if you could perhaps explain partly where that comes from, other than mere prejudice, and, for example, the sort of attitude towards the Jewish populations of Europe, and why this might be so significant. But I've got two other comrades who want to come in. First of all, Steve Freeman. So if you'd like to come in now, Steve.
No, Kevin, Dan Lazar has been his hand up for quite some time. He was by far the first person to want to speak. And then there's Matthew Jones as well.
Actually, that's not the case. I was not requesting to speak.
Ah, okay.
Sorry about that. I don't know how that happened.
Okay, Matthew Jones is a panelist already. I don't know if you can't see him.
Sorry, I'm using the participants box. Okay. Okay, go ahead now, Matthew. Sorry.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Right. Well, I think this has been really very useful. I think that in terms of obviously of Marx and Engels, they come from really a philosophical movement, the young Hegelians, and it's really their big thing is to take as Marx said, to take the dialectic of Hegel and remove the rational bit, because obviously Hegel's an idealist and thinks everything arises from the idea, and then take that kernel and turn it, as they say, turn it right way up. And then, of course, they mated it with the socialist movement. So, okay, well, we can shove all that lot together, and then we've got something serious about both in terms of what we can say about history, and a driving force in terms of the working class to change, and to both to change things and to understand how that change works, which obviously is a tremendous revelation. I mean, the other problem, of course, with Marx, of course, is he was very good at writing stuff. He wrote an enormous amount of stuff. He was very bad at getting it published. I mean, the number of publications he had during his lifetime was quite small, whereas the amount of work he left was enormous. It was published over the decades after his death and well into the 20th century. I mean, Grandrissa, for instance, which is his sort of overall sketch of his view of the world, is not published until the 30s. He's unavailable to Lenin and Trotsky, and is probably his most profound work. I think what you say about Proudhon, of course, I mean, becomes the dominant question. I mean, the Proudhonists do have a huge influence in the second half of the 19th century. I mean, the Proudhon is the chief politics of the Paris Commune is Proudhonist. The battle between Marx and Proudhon is carried on, and Engels and Proudhon into the SPD, into the French socialists. The whole thing is, the whole of that conflict in political ideas is central to the whole development of the socialist organization. But the other thing, of course, is that it's also in the nature of the I think it also critically is in the nature of the working class in terms of its conflict with the capitalists. As has been pointed out, the issue is that as soon as the working class organizes itself and comes into conflict with the capitalists, it tends to become political. As you say, the 10-hour day, the 8-hour day, all these things become intensely political and originate political organisation. What we then get, of course, is that the ruling class through concessions, particularly from the 1870s and 1880s onwards, manages to try and divorce the economic concessions and economic battles from political, and that's very successful on the part of the capitalist class, and manages to prevent that from happening, to nearly a degree. And hence you have, the difference when you have Lenin arguing against economism and all the rest of it. This whole sort of divorce between an economic battle and a political one, which hadn't really existed previous to that. So as you say, very interesting to look at, the nature of the evolution of that early part of the socialist movement. Thanks.
Kevin, you're muted.
My apologies. Steve Freeman, please.
There you go. Hi, Mark. Thank you for that introduction. It's led into lots of different ways. I want to just comment on Marx, I think, because I think one way to think about what Marx is doing in Capital is to see that he's doing a critique of two different things. One is to relate it to Owenite communism, Owen's ideas of communism. There's one link into it. So, and the other link in it is the one that Kevin's talked about, is French republicanism. And both of these two ideas, you could say Marx was critiquing both of those to put them, not to abolish them, by the way, but put them on a solid foundation. Now, on a scientific basis, so we're going to get scientific communism and scientific republicanism out of all of that. Now, what's the Republican link? Well, one of the important ideas of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, is the idea of liberty, which is so very important at that time. And liberty has two meanings. And one meaning is freedom to do what you like. That's the liberal view, which you can see goes into the free market, and it goes into the freedom to work, the freedom to have a job, all those kind of ideas of freedom, the neoliberal kind of ideas. And the other idea of freedom is the freedom from domination. So domination, where's the domination? So what Marx is doing in Capital is showing how capital is a form of domination over wage labor, that you instead of being free when you're at work, you're actually being completely dominated by the employer in the form of capital, and you're becoming a slave. So you're not given the freedom to work, you're not given those freedoms that the French Revolution promises, but you're given the domination of those things. So the domination, so you've got there the domination of the state, and you've got tied together with the domination of capital. And so emancipation, therefore, self-emancipation, which is the idea, comes through the workplace, where you are fighting against this domination of capital in the workplace. And then you have this domination, this autocracy in the state, where the workplace is backed up by the domination of the state. So there's an undercurrent of political aspects of Marx's. Capital is not just a purely economic treatise. It's actually, in a certain sense, a political treatise about freedom, liberation from domination. And I think we have to take that into account today. I would say that.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Anne McShane.
Hi, thanks, Mark. So basically, I have 3 points. Firstly, what I like about your presentation is by setting out the ideas and histories of these other thinkers and connecting Marx and Engels to them, you can see that the ideas of Marx and Engels were not ideas that just came out of the heads of these men, but that they were forged in struggle, in many senses in polemic against other ideas, and they took what was interesting and took what was useful and tried to give it, as Engels said, well, Engels did say that Marx had done it, didn't they? Put it on a scientific basis. So what I liked when I first started to read Marx and Engels was the polemical nature of their writings, and the fact that they didn't hold back when dealing with contemporary opponents in the movement, like anti-Düring. You only have to think of, they're everywhere. So they have that aspect to them, which is something I think that we really do need to think about today, because unfortunately, I think that so much of the left is kind of closed off from debates with other groups or other individuals. And, you know, you do need to have that battle. It is a battle of ideas. And then the second thing is that how, okay, like Engels was a factory owner, Marx was living up in Kentish Town or wherever he was, rising capital. But at the same time as that they also had very deep connections with the workers' movements, as you've pointed out, the struggle for the 8-hour day. And of course, Eleanor Marx, Marx's youngest daughter, was at the center of those struggles and at the center of the workers' movement. And I think myself that the biography, the two-part biography of Eleanor Marx, written by Yvonne Kapp, is a really useful read for anybody interested in kind of getting a sense of how, you know, how things were at the time. I certainly found it really very useful in terms of kind of getting the biography, but also, you know, the kind of, I think Yvonne Kapp did a very good job in showing the different connections between Marx and Engels, you know, with the movement, and also their connections with the German social democracy, with France and whatever. So really just all of that type of debate, struggle, internationalism, and
we can look to read those out, or
I don't know what that is. Okay, the last point I wanted to make is about this question of being prefigurative, and like in my view, perhaps I'd be interested to see what you thought, but the best example of Engels and Engels having written it after Marx's death, but saying that he wrote it using notes that Marx had already made, was the state-private property of the family. And obviously you mentioned his letter to Babel. I would have thought perhaps that was, you know, in connection with those writings. And for me, I think that those ideas are extremely interesting, like not simply because of the woman question, which is I'm interested in, but showing how the struggle for women's emancipation was at the center of the struggle for socialism. So therefore the state and the family were both institutions that needed to be transcended in the process. My own like research on the Zhenotiel, the Women's Department of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and indeed on Clara Zetkin, shows that they drew heavily on these ideas. You know, the writings of Engels and obviously the writing of August Bebel, Women and Socialism. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit about that. Perhaps I've kind of exceeded this historical period, but anyway, thanks so much. Bye.
Okay, thanks, Anne. I'll ask Marc to come back now and answer a few of those points.
Thanks, everybody. I'll not be able to respond to everything we just said, but I did listen with great interest. It was all great, but I'll just pick some things out of it. Kevin is asking about a bit of anti-Semitism, as was strictly speaking anti-Judaism, because you didn't really have the kind of a racialized view, but you know, it's anti-Judaism, all right. Why is that significant? In a way, it's what's seen to be new about capitalism. If you look at pre-capitalist modes of production, you know, let's say you have a landlord and you have a tenant farmer. The landlord exploits the peasant, you know, but the landlord also wants the peasant to stay alive, and wants them to have kids, and the kids to be there too, because they need to keep the farms going, they need to keep production going. So if you had, let's say, as you'd have quite frequently, a failure in the crops or something, very often the landlord would provide aid for the peasants to keep them alive and going, that kind of thing. So there's this notion that the old economy, there's a paternalistic relationship between, let's say, landlord and peasant. You know, it's exploitative, but it's paternalistic. What's seen as new about capitalism in some respects is that the capitalist doesn't have that paternalistic relationship. You pay your wages. When you're not paying wages, you don't care. You know, when they're too old to work for you, you don't care what happens to them. You just get new proletarians. This is why Marx said the struggle over the 10-hour working day is so important, because the instinct of capitalists is more or less to work workers to death. You know, when they can't work anymore and they go off and shuffle off to die, just get new workers in. Now, this idea that there's something new about capitalists and that they don't have a paternalistic relationship to the workers That becomes associated with Jewish people because Jews are seen to not have a paternalistic relationship to other people. Why? Because they're a persecuted minority. Therefore, they don't have this sense of connection to everybody else, so the argument goes. And so the argument goes, the modern capitalist is a bit like the Jew. The capitalist only looks upon the rest of society for what they can, in an instrumental way. They don't have any other relationship with the rest of society. Now, this is not at all how Jewish people think or work or anything like that, but that's why you often get this comparison being made at the time. Marx writes on the Jewish question. It's a pretty unpleasant work because it's an elaborate joke. It's basically saying the bourgeoisie are becoming Jewish. That is, the bourgeoisie are behaving in this way we call Jewish, which is you don't have any kind of paternalistic relationship to the people who work for you. You have a simply instrumental relationship. Now, it's an unpleasant joke when we read it now for obvious reasons, you know, but in a way you can see what he's trying to get at. He's trying to say, don't you go around accusing the Jews as if they're a different bourgeoisie. You're all behaving in this way. You all treat workers in a purely instrumental fashion. And because of that, you're going to be overthrown. It's part of the reason why these arguments are floating about. And it's why you get it across society and within the socialist movement. Most obvious with, it's a bit of a side issue for Marx, you know. Proudhon is seriously anti-Semitic in the way he thinks. And that probably relates to his idealization of the peasant family. Basically, Jews never get the chance to be peasants because they never get the chance to possess a farm. They're forced to live in the margins of society. And so they're seen by peasants as outside their mode of existence and therefore hostile to it. So you get proper anti-Semitism with somebody like Proudhon. It's not entirely absent with almost all other socialist thinkers. I don't think Flora Tristan has much to say about it. On that point, I mean, what do these people say about women? Absolutely, Engels, particularly drawing upon Morgan, talks about the origins of family, private property in the state. I think most of what he says is wrong, actually, because I think Morgan is wrong. But Tristan is definitely worth looking at because he really gets the sharp end of it. If your husband has stolen your children and is trying to kill you, literally, you get a pretty good sense of what's wrong with patriarchy, and she writes very effectively on that. On the point about evolution from, so if we look at the French Revolution, the idea of the French Revolution is, as I say, you get your demonstration, turns into a riot, turns into the insurrection. That's basically the model of radicalism in the French Revolution, taken over by Bouffe, it's taken over by Buonarroti, it's taken over by Blanc, and Blanc is the guy who argues this. You have your conspiratorial underground organization, which will organize the demonstrations and will then lead the demonstration into insurrection at the key point. That'll happen more or less spontaneously, but you need the conspirators to act as a trigger. It does kind of work. If you look at the overthrow of the monarchy in 1870, that's kind of how it happens, so they're not madmen, and we're also talking about pre-democratic society. It's very difficult to organize legally, so it's not surprising that a legal organization looks kind of cool. But the other model is the Chartis model, which is mass organization in a non-conspiratorial fashion. And that's really taken from the Irish movement, actually. The Chartists take it from the Irish movement. Flora Tristan, again, she says this should be the model. And she inaugurates that in many respects in the socialist movement in the 1840s, though Louis Blanc is less interested in mass organization. He's more interested in journalism, and he's a very good journalist. Marx and Engels are they're a bit in the middle, Marx always has a lot of time for Blanc, always has a lot of time for him throughout his life. He thinks he's a pretty cool dude in many respects. Marx looked to the mass movement, but he also looked to if you like, the advanced political cadre knowing what they're about and being able to give the lead at the crucial time. I think that's really how Marx thinks about these things. And that's how he sees the Communist League. It's how he sees every organization that he's ever involved in. And it's notable, he always wants the Blancists involved. He thinks these guys know how to organize. He wants them involved in the First International. He wants them involved afterwards. And he wants to be pals with Blanc. He's forever trying to get in touch with Blanc, and Blanc is usually in prison. So Marx and Engels, they are not Blancists themselves. You know, if they're close to anything, they're close to the left Chartist tradition. As I indicated, with left Chartist tradition actually owed something to that kind of Blancist organizational tradition. And Bronte O'Brien is a good example of that. So I think Marx and Engels' relationship to Blancism is complicated. They take elements from it. And of course, later on, I think, though Bolshevism always disavows it, in practice, they also take quite a lot from Blancism. I think that could reasonably be said. So one way of looking at Marx is that up until about 1850, 1851, he's a bit hypnotized by Blancism and a bit hypnotized by the French Revolutionary insurrection tradition. And from that point, he moved away from it. I think he's never completely hypnotized by it, and he never completely moved away from it. That's a bit exaggerated. There are lots of other good points made. Again, I can't deal with all of them. Somebody said quite rightly that Marx wasn't that good at getting published. He's not that bad at getting published in a way. He's quite he's not good with publishers. He promises them deadlines and never meets them, you know. But he does publish a lot. If you look at his articles he writes for the American press, it's a ton of stuff, you know. Marx is, you know, he's you could write for Weekly Worker, put it like that. You could knock out, you know, 3,000 words every week without breaking sweat, you know. Pretty impressive in that regard. So there's an awful lot of stuff he writes which doesn't get published, but his record would compare pretty well to the average academic. But the main thing about, not the main thing, but something we tend to forget about Marx is that he's a serious organizer, you know. I mean, why does he have such influence in the First International? Partly because of his ideas, no doubt. It's also because he puts a ton of work into just the grind of organization. He's a very good secretary, and that earns him favor with in particular, the British trade unionists, who otherwise, I think, would look at him rather skeptically as this kind of slightly odd German with a funny accent and a high-pitched voice who goes on about Hegel a bit too much, you know. Okay, I'm not sure about that, but boy, this guy can organize, and he really does that very well. So Marx, we think of as the thinker for very good reasons. He is a thinker. We forget to think, we kind of forget about, as has been pointed out, the polemicizer. He can do pretty down and dirty battling, and you know, if you look at his defense of the Parts Commune, it's really good, stirring, polemical stuff. But he can do organization too. And Engels is never as good at it, but the post-Marx Engels, after Marx's death, Engels gets a lot better at it. And one of the reasons we have a letter from Engels to Bebel, it's just one letter out of a ton that he writes. And Hal Draper makes the point is that to understand Marxist politics, a good place not to start, but a good place to go is the correspondence between Engels and Bebel, Engels and Bernstein, Engels and Kautsky, because Engels just knocks letters out day after day, week after week. And in a way, it's an organizational mode as well as a political education mode. So they really believe, Marx and Engels, in not just writing the great books, but in some respects, more importantly, on a day-by-day basis, is grinding out the letters, grinding out the debates. That's how you sharpen ideas. But for them, particularly for Marx, it's never really a point of, sometimes, but it's not usually a point of, you know, winning some intellectual point. It's usually winning a position, an agreed position on which you can move forward, which is why Marx is never more in his element than when he's working with a fairly wide range of thinkers, trying to find common ground on which they can move forward. And Marx thinks that's worth doing because fundamentally Marx thinks that the intellectuals are secondary to the movement, not that ideas are secondary to the movement, but an active worker movement will of its own momentum vindicate the ideas in which he believes. You'll maybe leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Just before I go on, I've got two more speakers. There was also a question from Mary Lynham, which I've sent to you in the chat. So perhaps in the next round you could take that up. But I'd like to call in now Alan Thiesby, please.
Right, yeah, I was going to bring up Marie's point about new technology and robotisation. Marx and Engels were talking about this long before it happened. They could see the things happening with I suppose with coal and steel, were like important things for factories. Production. There had been water power, people used canals, people used sea traffic, but coal and using steam power, and then steel, iron and steel works and things like this made a massive change. But they also foresaw other new technologies. They couldn't be specific, but basically they knew we were all going to have mobile phones and robots running things before we even thought about those things. They were thinking Star Trek sort of technology without any details. They knew that this was inevitable. It's an inevitable drive in capitalism, but it has its contradictions because capitalism relies, capitalists can only survive by exploiting the working class, human beings, right? By expropriating their labour power, their labour time. Marx mentioned the reserve army of labour. And a contradiction it is, the more you get rid of workers, the more you use technology, you're going to get a bigger reserve army of labour, which you can use to hold wages down. But it's increasingly difficult, depending on the cost of technology, obviously. It was certainly, until recently, increasingly difficult for capitalists to make profits from robots. Artificial intelligence and various other things might change that, we don't know, but traditionally up to now, the more robotisation, the more technology you've had, the harder it is to actually make profits, and this creates massive tensions for individual capitalists. Obviously, it can lead to a very deep crisis. Also, socially and politically, it can be now very difficult to run a massive level of unemployment in a modern society. Without really grinding down. Perhaps this is the stage we're going through with capitalism red in tooth and claw, might be back to normal. Capitalism needs to drive, to smash up the social gains of welfare state, social gains of trade unions, other things like that, to drive people down. And logically, there could be a tendency to just people being accept that, dismissive, or it could be various fight. It could be a revolutionary fight back, or there could be a threat of fight back, and it could be fascism. None of these things are stable for capitalism as a whole. So individual capitalists feel in a dangerous position, but as a whole, structure of economic structure, it's a very dangerous situation just to rely on modernization, new technology, and pushing millions and millions of people onto a dole and crushing them. It's a very dangerous strategy. I think anyway. So I think I'd like Marc perhaps to comment on that.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Next speaker, Alec Price.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think my picture quality is horrendous, but there we go. So thanks to the speaker for going through the various sort of political ideas that were about at the time. I'm due to be speaking on the Paris Commune in a couple of weeks' time, and that is a huge event where workers actually end up taking power for the first time. But all those ideas that have been mentioned today, they're all still around during the Paris Commune, sort of contending with one another to be the methods, to be the actions as well, as to what workers actually do when they do take power. I think when you're thinking about contending ideologies, contending methods, it's a bit like if you think of a rope, and within a rope, there's lots of different threads, and at times they might all be leading in the same direction, but under stress and strain, the rope can start to fray, and the different threads become more visible. I think that's kind of how different political ideologies operate, but different ways of trying to organise the mass of working class. Some of them are frankly no good, and have proved to be no good. Others are absolutely essential if we are serious about winning. I think if you look at the Corbyn movement today, and as it's been, the same kind of thing's been about. You've had lots of different types of ideas as to how the mass movement should move forward. It's taken the form of, should we have mandatory re-selection of MPs or not? Should we speak out in defence of colleagues who are unjustly suspended or not? All those different ways of dealing with situations are present today, and some of them trace their roots back to the period that has been mentioned. So for me, the key thing is, it's not so much to have like a full working knowledge of all the different trends, although that can be useful. It's about ensuring we're on the right one, and it's only through looking at how ideas have played out in practice in history that you can kind of work out which ideas are going to be useful when it comes down to it, and which are going to be no good and lead to us repeating the same mistakes again and again. So I think the only question really I'd have about this is obviously in 1848 there's revolutions all over Europe, including in France. The way that it plays out in France kind of reminded me of the Brexit situation in a way, where you've got these different contending forces amongst the bourgeois as well. And there's a series of different governments, and it ends up being a coup in France in 1851, where Napoleon's nephew takes charge. And Marx writes about these coups in a book called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. With Brumaire, it's just a month of the revolutionary calendar. So this idea of like a sort of Bonaparte figure, I think is quite interesting and important. I think there's a certain element of it around in the world today when you look at figures like Bolsonaro in Brazil, to a certain degree, Trump in America, to a slightly lesser degree, Johnson in the UK, this kind of Bonaparte figure, which is something that arises in this period, partly to stop workers coming to the fore, and partly because the various political ideologies that have been mentioned have failed to lead the mass of workers or the mass movement to victory. So I just wonder if the speaker had any particular things they wanted to say on Bonapartism as a method of the ruling class, particularly in the period that we're discussing, but also whether he thinks it's relevant to aspects of some of the political characters we've got today.
Okay, thanks, Alec. I don't have any further requests for questions or comments, and we are getting towards the end. So I'll ask Marc to come in and sum up now and respond to those questions.
Hey, thanks, Kevin, and everybody. Yeah, the technology thing. I mean, in a way, it's a bit unsurprising that Marx is quite so much into technology, because most of the socialists are at the time. And it's partly we tend to think of the 19th century, it's all olden days and it's all horses and it's horses and steam and that kind of thing. But if you lived in it, it felt like technological change at super fast speed. If you think about it, until the mid-1820s, the fastest you could move was as fast as a horse. That had been the same as fast as you could move in the time of Julius Caesar, or in the time of the Sumerian Empire, 5,000 years previously. By the time you get to 1840, you've got trains which are zipping along at 70 miles an hour, crisscrossing the continent. You've got entire new towns and cities appearing based upon steam. And these are very striking things to look upon. People talk about approaching an industrial town, and you can see the glow of fire from the forges. You can see smoke all over the place. And if you go into London, and you see these, industrial era train stations, and they're cathedrals of metal. They're just extraordinary, So everybody's got quite a strong sense that they're living through an enormous acceleration in history. This is very, very striking. In a way, more so than it is in our era. I don't think there isn't that sense of change as much, if you look out in the street, things look a bit different than they would have done 20, 30, 40 years ago, but nothing like the transformation that people would have seen in the first half of the 19th century. It's a real so it's a kind of accelerationist period. So Marx is very interested in what technology might do in the future. And most of our socialists are. Some people don't like it. Proudhon doesn't like it. He says, well, look, you get technology, you get increased brutalization, you get this kind of smelly, demoralized proletariat. Marx, on the contrary, sees technology as representing the future. So does Saint-Simon, so does Robert Owen. In particular, Robert Owen's a great enthusiast for this kind of thing. And that kind of interest in technology, it's post-dates Marx and this generation too. I was reading a while ago, Karl Kautsky, and he wrote a book called Materialist Conception of History in 1837. And Kautsky, of course, was kind of saw himself as a representative of Marx after Marx's death, really. And there's a bit in there where Kautsky says, yeah, Africa looks kind of backward now. But he says, I bet you at some point they'll use those deserts to generate electricity from the sun. And then large parts of Africa will become really central and important to the world economy. Even now, that is not only a kind of forward-looking idea, but quite a good idea, So it shows that this interest in technology is always really part of socialist thinking at this time. Marx also has this view that, first of all, Marx is disagreeing with those socialists who say that a just society would see people getting the full value of their labor, which is a slogan associated with early socialism. And Marx disagrees with that, really, because Marx says, well, look at wealth. A lot of wealth is produced by the collective worker. That is by the way workers cooperate. And you can't divide that up into individual workers. You know, it's more than the aggregate. It's the fact that workers are brought together. The collective production itself is a force of production. And similarly, technology. Technology doesn't create value in Marx's thinking, but it does create wealth. It does create stuff. So part of what Marx is arguing is that society as a whole must have collective control of what is made and how it's distributed, because society as a whole, the collective worker and the technology produced by that society produces the wealth. It's not just the individual workers. And therefore, he's against, for example, Proudhon, who says, well, it's the individual worker and his family. And I emphasize his because that's how Proudhon would have looked on it. No, Proudhon would say it's the individual families produce all the wealth. Therefore, the families should control the wealth. And Marx is saying that's not true. Society as a whole produces wealth in modern conditions. Therefore, society as a whole must have a say in the disposition of that wealth, which is why Marx and Engels see an important place for the cooperative. You know, they're not just they're not statist in that sense, but they believe that the state must initially represent society, because society itself is a producer of the wealth and culture of society, and ultimately society should represent itself. So in that sense, they're very interested in technology. They see a certain role in the dynamics of capitalism, which gets all quite complicated. I think some comrades spoke very well on that. I'll not try and go down that rabbit hole, so it gets quite confusing. It's a more general point I'd want to make, is that Marx is in that tradition which Robert Owen was in, and Fourier in a way was in, which is technology is cool. We like this stuff. You know, it doesn't have to be brutalizing. Proudhon is in that other tradition, which is technology is not cool. You know, it's degrading. In a way, that's two tendencies. I think really the Marx tendency, which is quite enthusiastic about technology, is always likely to do better in the longer run, because I think workers, at least from the 1830s, 40s, is thinking that technology might do me out of a job, but it's inescapable, and we can see how it can be bent to the good of society. It doesn't have to be a burden on society. And on the point about, I mean, I agree at that point in that, you know, you have to look at what ideas work and what ideas don't work. I think it's a good idea, I mean, as an historian, I'm interested in all these ideas, you know. I think there's very few ideas which don't have something to them, you know. I'm happy to reject Proudhon's anti-Semitism and anti-feminism without too much thinking. But his argument about the cogency of small-scale production, I think is still important and interesting. You know, it is a less alienating way of living and working. Most people prefer working in a small workplace than a big anonymous workplace. You know, these things are still worth thinking about, worth doing. Bakunen's conspiratorialism, okay, you know, that's got all kinds of problems with it, in that it tries to, if you like, kind of heavy a demonstration into a riot, into an insurrection. I don't think it's much of a model for going forward. His argument, however, is that you need to think seriously about how one organizes politically, how one develops people who have a sense of intervening in the movement. These things unquestionably are useful, you know, and in a way, when it comes to the you know, there's lots of interesting things Bakunen says about that, which Marx doesn't, and it's worth reading people like Bakunen. So I doubt there's some thinkers you can entirely forget about, sure, you know, but I think it's a real loss for the movement that Flora Tristan is forgotten about, more or less, you know. These people are worth disinterring. It's a real loss for the movement that Louis Blanc is forgotten about, certainly in the English-speaking world. He says an awful lot of very interesting stuff. He's forgotten about partly because he's against the Paris Commune, which turns out to be a bad idea for your reputation. And in many respects, that's justified. You should suffer for that. But it'd be a bad thing if we say he's not worth reading or not worth thinking about, because he does say lots of stuff which is really useful, you know. Marx is, when you read his letters, is very dismissive of Louis Blanc, partly because Louis Blanc is a real short arse, and he laughs at that a lot. But actually he does take him seriously as a thinker, not as seriously as others, but he recognizes these people have interesting things to say. The Paris Commune is made much more by the Bakunenists than anybody else, really. But the Paris Commune also marks the end of a particular Bakunenist tradition. Well, it does kind of recreate itself later on. And you find that happening in history, that ideologies will have a lot of weight and power behind them. As circumstances change, they lose that weight and power. But if we were to think about the dialectic, you know, insofar as it's useful to think in those terms, one thing the dialectic suggests is that nothing in history is ever pointless, and no idea in history is ever entirely disappears. Rather, it gets subsumed in the next stage. And you can get a bit schematic about that, but it's also a pretty useful way to think about things. I'll maybe leave it there.
Well, thanks very much, Mark. And I particularly like the idea of ideas being subsumed and reappearing. And I suppose more importantly, the idea that all sorts of struggles have contributed to our contemporary movement. And I suppose one of the things that we're trying to do with this session and other sessions is to talk about the relevance of the history of our movement and what we can both learn from that history, but also the sort of ways that that history has shaped us. Well, we'll be closing the session now, but I'll just remind comrades that recordings and book lists linked to this session and to some of the previous sessions will be available. Next week's session is on the Second American Revolution. It looks at the American Civil War and the struggle against slavery. And given the recent events in the United States, the election and some of the politics associated with that, Black Lives Matter, and so on, I'm sure that will be a very useful session. So thanks, Mark, and thanks to all the comrades who contributed, and I'll see you next week. Goodbye.